What do you see when you imagine the future? When we picture what's to come, we often think of innovations that take us to new heights. Some of them are already here, and every day, thousands more make the jump from our imagination into reality. Nowhere is this more evident than here in Japan. Fourth industrial revolution technologies are fundamentally transforming the way we do things. All this is happening so fast, and we must do more than just keep up. These emerging technologies open up boundless possibilities of what our future could look like. Technology is not a simple solution to our problems. It poses questions that we need to answer and guidelines we need to write together. That's why we're all here, a global event hosted by Japan that brings together the world's leading voices across disciplines and geographies. How technology will shape our tomorrow depends on the choices we make today. And that starts now.
Hello, and welcome to this session on countering harmful content. I'm Mina Al-Arabi, the editor-in-chief of The National in Abu Dhabi. And we have a great panel with us today to discuss how we can counter harmful content. From pedophilia to terrorism, harmful content online is a reflection of wider social ills, but its proliferation and where it can reach makes online content that much more potent. There are many examples of how both governments, but also tech companies are trying to counter that harmful content, but quite often it feels like it's too little and too late. In March 2021, latest figures are there are 4.6 billion people using the internet, 316 million of them joining in just the last 12 months. So, and more of us are connected and online. We are subjected to very useful online content, but also harmful online content. As an example, TikTok announced that in the first half of 2020, they took down 104.5 million videos, some because of copyright issues, but many of them because of harmful content. So issues of liability, who's actually responsible, who's publishing? Are you as an individual user responsible, or are the online platforms responsible? Or is government responsible for regulation? Transparency, how are decisions made about what gets taken down and who has the right to make that call? And importantly, consumer welfare, who decides what's right for us? All these issues we are going to be discussing as we have representatives of international organizations, the tech giants, and government here. We have with us Julie Inman-Grant, who is E-Safety Commissioner at the Office of E-Safety Commissioner from Australia. Julie, good to see you.
Thank you.
We have with us Simon Milner, who's Vice President Public Policy for the Asia Pacific of Facebook, based in Singapore. And
Hello.
And we have with us Lean Wendland, who's Chief of Business and Human Rights Unit at UN Human Rights. Hi, Lean. Right, so I'm going to jump right in and I'm going to start with you, Julie. But before I do, just a reminder to those of us who are watching us live, you can send in your questions. Please type it in for us and I will take in your questions as we go through this session. So Julie, I'm going to start with you first. What do we mean when we say harmful content? And how can government decide what is harmful content?
Right. Well, the E-Safety Commissioner was established 6 years ago and set out to sort of answer that question. We actually started quite gingerly as the Children's E-Safety Commissioner after a very famous TV presenter who was struggling with mental health issues was brutally trolled on Twitter and ended up taking her own life. That resulted in a huge petition that was signed and sent to government asking that they do more to take on this issue. But they were concerned about the free speech issues. So we tackled initially child sexual abuse material and serious youth cyberbullying, anything that threatens an Australian child and is seriously threatening, humiliating, intimidating intimidating, or harassing. So not just banter, not just put downs, seriously harmful content. And, you know, we try and be as objective as possible, but it's always going to depend on circumstances and context. It's important to point out that we're not policing the internet for harmful material, that we actually rely on citizens to collect evidence to report to the platform first, and then report to us if seriously harmful content isn't taken down. So we were really set up as a safety net when some of this falls through the cracks. We're not seeking to become the content moderators ourselves. You know, we believe that the platforms build the digital roads. They also need to erect the digital guardrails and the safety guardrails and be, you know, applying the virtual seatbelts.
And Julie, how do you respond to people who say there is government overreach? I mean, you're right in saying that you turn to the platforms first and you don't see this as a policing role, but others would push back and say, yeah, but the fact that there's even an e-commissioner, the fact that if it's seen as harmful, then government can have that role. How do you respond to those who would criticize about overreach?
You know, well, as somebody who does believe in free speech and worked for Twitter and Microsoft for more than 22 years, I actually saw day in and day out when I was at Twitter that targeted abuse, particularly those targeting women, those who identify as LGBTQI, those with a disability, those of different ethnicities and religions, were actually silenced through targeted abuse. And of course, it's rooted in misogyny and racism, and it's surfaced by social media. You allow harmful content like that to, you know, to fester, you're going to have a very toxic place, and you're not going to be promoting free speech. You're going to be suppressing it over time.
Thank you, Julie. Simon, I want to turn to you. Julie uses the analogy of a digital road, the need for guardrails and seatbelts. And so what type of regulation does Facebook think is acceptable, and what role does it see for government?
Well, look, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to set out our perspectives on this. We've actually been advocating for regulation when it comes to content issues for a number of years now. And just last year, we put out a white paper. Are you struggling to hear me, Mina, from the look in your face, or are you not enjoying my answer? Looks like we may have a technical problem. I'll keep going though. Okay. So we put out a white paper last year, in which we set out some initial thinking on the right kinds of frameworks for how to hold large digital platforms like Facebook or TikTok or Twitter to account for how they deal with harmful content. And there are a number of things that we particularly focused on there, including providing the right kind of incentives for companies to invest in this space. And so, for instance, if you make companies completely liable for anything and everything that anybody posts on their platform, that's not creating the right kind of incentives to deal with the problem. Something that takes into account the global nature of the internet. So if we have, you know, many different approaches across multiple different countries, that's going to be incredibly hard to comply with, but also, frankly, lead to a fragmented internet, which hopefully nobody wants. How do we protect freedom of expression? Taking into account different technologies and also being kind of proportional and focusing on the most serious harms. And so we think a systems-based approach, something that says you companies need to put in place systems for dealing with harmful content. You need to have measurement for how, you know, to understand how effective your systems are, and you need to be transparent about it. And actually, we're doing all those things, so we're not waiting for regulation, but we do want to also see regulation which properly holds us to account for things that then have a demonstrable impact on tackling harmful content and the experience everybody has online.
It's fascinating. I was reading details about Facebook and the fact that you have 35,000 people working on your safety team 24/7 hours a day and in 60 languages. So the scale of the problem sometimes is really worth taking into account. But I would say, you know, as you're saying here, you know, the need for systems, but how much of that can you automate, and how much of it has to be human decision making?
So you can automate a lot. One of the things that a lot of those people, most of those people are not reviewing content. They are designing technologies, iterating on those technologies to continually improve them so we find this harmful content before other people see it. And in our content standards enforcement report, we explain the impact of this. And so to give you an example, 3 years ago when we were looking to detect hate speech using technology, we would find around a quarter of the content that was violated, and we were finding it through technology. Now it's 97%. So that technology is constantly improving as the machines learn, as we bring across more languages. But human review is also very important because context really matters for much of this type of content. Some things, frankly, there's never a context. I mean, Julie mentioned child sexual abuse. There's no context in which that is ever allowed on our services. But there are some contexts where rather difficult content may be allowed because it's highlighting an issue in society. It's part of a news story, maybe by the National. And so context matters. And frankly, we don't always get it right. So that combination of technology and human review is extremely important.
Fascinating to hear that 97% of the content that's caught now is through technology. But then there's always
hate speech. So it's different numbers for different types of content, but that's just an example of it. But all the information is there in our content standards enforcement report, which I'd very much encourage people, if you want to dig deep into this, check out that report.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Lean, I want to turn to you because when we talk about these issues, of course, there's always that conversation about freedom of speech, who's making the decision, if it's a machine or a human, while, protecting the end user, children, of course, primarily, but also just generally protecting society. So I want to ask you from your approach, from a UN vantage point, but also business and human rights is a very interesting title, and trying to combine those two. Many of these platforms, or the vast majority of platforms, are actually businesses, and they're there to earn profit. They also have a responsibility. So from your vantage point, how do you make that balance, and what responsibility do these companies have?
Thank you very much. I think there's a number of really important points that have already been made. So I want to start off by saying that from a human rights perspective, obviously governments have core responsibilities under international human rights standard to protect against the harm that has been that can arise from online from this kind of content. But we also have standards, human rights responsibilities for companies set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the authoritative standard for this kind of to guide where are the responsibilities that companies have, what are the kind of actions they have to take. I think it's important when we're talking about this that to say that freedom of expression is indeed a fundamental human rights, but under international human rights law, it is not absolute. And in fact, what is termed incitement to hatred is not even protected speech. But likewise, it's important to say that it's not in the eye of the beholder. There are very clear standards and universally globally agreed approaches for how to determine what constitutes, for example, incitement to hatred. We've got what's called the Rabat Plan of Action, which was adopted and endorsed by governments from all regions of the world on what are the kind of approach and criteria you need to apply in order to determine what kind of content is unacceptable, and in this case, for what kind of content should be criminalized. And some of the factors have already been made. Context, very big. Context really does matter, and that's what makes this challenging, that something that can be appropriate and useful and positive in a way said if it's through, for example, journalists or human rights defenders exposing the existence of neo-Nazi group or whatever, is very different, exposing that kind of speech, than when it comes from those communities themselves with an intent to harm. So very much context specific, but we do have rules. This is the kind of challenges that the human rights system has worked on and grappled with for 75 years. So we're not in the dark. We're not starting from scratch. A number of the challenges, because of the online and the scale and the speed and the transboundary nature of it, means that we how we technically do it can vary, but I think that the underlying principles and the normative foundations for how to navigate this space are there. The human rights system operates with fundamental test for limitation, legality, proportionality, necessity. Something has to be clear enough that people, if their speech is limited, there has to be clear that they knew that it was not acceptable. Has to be proportionate, the intervention, to respond to the specific risk, and it has to be necessary, for example, to protect the rights of others. So there are a number of principles that anyone, be they a government or a company struggling to define the space, that they can draw on. So it's not a law-free zone, we say. We do have a lot of existing tools, as I said, developed over decades. And we're really happy in the work that I'm leading on what we call the BTEC project, where we are working directly with a number of companies, including Facebook, to try to say, well, how do we do that in practice? But we're not challenging the underlying sense of norms and the underlying responsibilities, and also the role of governments in this space, that this is not something that governments can say, this is just the responsibility of companies, they must just do it. And companies can't just say, well, we'll do it until governments tell us otherwise. This really is a shared space with distinct but complementary responsibilities and duties. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
May I just add, Mina, that we have to remember it's not just content that we're talking about here. We're talking about conduct as well as human malfeasance. So nobody is pretending this is an easy or quick fix. It's very contextual. But as we talk about fundamental human rights and balancing them, I think we may need to look at a recalibration of some of those rights and make sure that we have a proper balance between privacy, safety, security, freedom of expression. They're not necessarily diametrically opposed or mutually exclusive. But we have seen some recent situations, for instance, the e-privacy directive in the EU preventing the scanning, companies from scanning for child sexual abuse material. Children still have the right to be free from violence. They have a right to dignity. So how do you balance that right to privacy or data protection with those other fundamental rights?
Lean, can I ask you to answer Julie? I know, Julie, in some ways you're throwing up the question rhetorically, but also looking for an answer. So Lean, how do we make that balance? And also, exactly as Julie said, some of these rights, that was the point I was going to say, sometimes these rights are not mutually exclusive, but sometimes they do counter one another.
Well, again, I think if one can't have regulation or that specifies every single situation that comes up. I mean, we would constantly be playing catch up, and that's why it's so important to rely the specific situation and make it something that is founded on broadly agreed and universal standards that informs the specific decisions. Because again, and also if we're trying to play catch up with specific technologies, they move very quickly all the time. So as the point that you were, I think we'll come to a little bit later around how can regulators they'll be behind the technology. So from our side, we're saying be wherever the technology takes us, and whatever the specific challenge or issue, be it child pornography, be it racial discrimination, be it any one of the other issues that is sort of covered under the basket of harmful content, is informed by shared fundamental values and principles, then we can elaborate the specific responses responses that are appropriate, that are proportionate, that are necessary to deal with that problem, as opposed to think that we can, write laws or regulations that will be comprehensive for every single situation. It obviously the problem is too wide, and that in the human rights system is how these challenges have been developed, and the understanding of where the right balance, for example, between the role of free media and exposing uncomfortable truth versus those who are saying the uncomfortable truth, that has been evolved through case law, through decades, as I said, of deliberation and scholarship and practical application of laws.
Thank you, Lean. Simon, I want to bring you in here and ask you a question that's actually from the audience. And it says, what support can be provided to fact-checking organizations who are on the front line of combating misinformation, but often they're either small outfits or they're charities. They don't have the strength to disperse their information, so to speak. How do you see the role of Facebook or other tech companies there?
I think this is very much like other aspects of these challenges that we've been discussing. It's all about partnership. And that's why we have many partnerships with third-party fact checkers all across the world, including in APAC, where I sit. And they help us address the problem of misinformation. Because I don't think anybody really wants Facebook or Twitter or Google deciding what's true or not. These independent third-party fact checkers authorized by the IFCN are exactly set up to do this, and so we have a very well-established process for working with them, for them to review content and for them to for us to act on that. Typically with a label on content that's been deemed to be false and massively reducing the distribution it gets across our services. That's been incredibly helpful for us. And including, particularly, for instance, on the issue of COVID misinformation. These partnerships have been very helpful for us to address the problem of misinformation, both about the virus itself and now about vaccines.
Thank you, Simon. Julie, I want to bring you in for a question also from the audience, which is, how do we ensure safety and inclusion can grow hand in hand?
Well, I think if you are providing safety, then you're creating a pathway for greater inclusion. We see the prevalence of online abuse, as I said, of people who experience or have one of many intersectional factors being a challenge. As I said, those of different ethnicities, women, and it's not just the prevalence, that the prevalence is 3 times as high. It's the tenor and tone and the way that the attack vectors work when they're targeting these people. So you could end up silencing so many people if these particular voices aren't protected. And I should say that, a number of the platforms are putting into place policies that deal with online hate and protecting those who have protected characteristics. But inclusion is something that we really need to be thinking about. If you think about 2020, a year most of us would have really liked to have forgotten, the internet became an essential utility. Everybody gravitated to the internet to learn, to work, to communicate, to entertain, and you sort of overlay that with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and all of humanity on the internet, and you have the perfect storm. So we saw all forms of abuse supercharged. So we saw a 600% increase in image-based abuse at one point. So as people turned to digital intimacy tools, scammers always come out, either when they're often when there is a natural disaster playing upon people's best instincts, but also social engineering and manipulating people. And we saw a 100% increase or a doubling of child sexual abuse material. And we saw about a 50% increase in both adult cyber abuse and youth-based cyberbullying. So, again, one of the things that's really going to drive people away is experiencing abuse and not having a place to go, and not having reliable systems to rely on to keep them safe.
Can I ask Julie, just the technicality, when you say we saw this increase, is this reported or is this both you monitoring and reported content?
No, we don't police the internet. It's all our citizens reporting to us. We've got a lot of guidance. The schemes run differently. So for the youth-based cyberbullying scheme, for instance, we do require the young person or their parent or guardian to report to the platform first, because that's the most expeditious way to get the content down. And in fairness to Facebook and Instagram, there have been times where very vulnerable children have been targeted and they've gotten the content taken down within 12 minutes. But but as Simon said, technology can go some way to detecting and removing content, but it still hasn't caught up to, let's say, targeted advertising systems. We can target advertising with deadly precision, but natural language processing and even AI isn't where it needs to be. We all have concerns about AI and bias. So there's always going to need to be some human decision making involved.
Thank you. So I think we've not only highlighted the problem, we've also highlighted some ways of tackling it. But what I'd like all three of you to address is give us very specific examples of best practices where you see that this is a way that we can tackle some of this issue. So I'm going to start with you, Lean, if I may, of where you see this is a good example of best practice and that could be perhaps replicated or scaled up.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit careful about sort of pronouncing something best practice. I mean, I think I'm not sure anyone has gotten it completely right, and that's not for lack of trying on behalf of very many serious actors, be they in government and Julie's role or Simon and Facebook. It is work in progress, and I think that's that. But having said that, we see, for example, companies like Facebook coming out with a clear human rights commitment, being out there very much with a clear human rights statement that says this is the kind of human rights standards that we will be operating under, holding themselves to account and allowing stakeholders to hold them to account for how they need that. I mean, it's a new policy that came out in just a few weeks ago. So obviously the implementation will be monitored, and they have said so themselves. You need to hold us to account for what we're saying. But I think that the more companies are coming out with embracing their responsibility to ensure that their products are not causing harm is a way to start. I think the rest, again, there are questions of scale that make it. This is not there will never be perfection in the space. I think that can't be the standard, but the clear commitment to work in a serious way. And we're very pleased with the BTEC project, as I mentioned, that we have a number of the biggest platforms that are engaging with us in trying to come up with some of these practical, how do we do it? What does good look like? Because there's a lot of experimentation and a lot of stuff going on. I think in governments, I think having the regulatory framework, again, that is not ad hoc or responding to the latest outrage or the latest crisis, but really founded in these universal values. I sound like a broken record, but I can't overemphasize this enough, that this field is moving so fast and the issues are moving so fast that if we don't have a very clear compass to navigate, it'll be all over the place, and we are not creating the kind of good practice and scale in the practice and coherence, alignment between different individual governments taking action versus collective action. This is a collective action problem. So governments that provide, like in Julie's case, you have a place, you have an access to a kind of remedy. You can bring it to a different level. I think those are the kind of models. There is not one single model that will be perfect, but I think having a serious grappling with all stakeholders involved doing their different pieces, but founded on the global values, because otherwise we're going to spend all our time discussing where is the right limit, instead of saying, well, we have the underlying norms and the principles to those whose job it is to make a particular determination to do that. And we can move on with creating that more of that infrastructure, be it in the child rights protection, gender bias, AI oversight, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about having a multitude of effective approaches that can make the difference rather than a specific one.
Lean, that's perfect, because your point about having those almost guidelines and frameworks are so important, because sometimes an issue becomes an absolute storm and it's politicized. Either companies are put under a lot of strain, there's calls for boycotts, or a particular government suddenly is under a lot of strain to make swift decisions because this it's like wildfire online. And so then without those parameters, you can err and you can make mistakes because you need to act. And without that framework, you can misstep for sure. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Julie, I want to turn to you. I think Lean posed a lot of points there, but also to learn from you in terms of best practice and what you see works.
Sure. Well, this may seem strange coming from a regulator, but I don't think we're going to regulate our way out of these issues or arrest our way out of them. And so one of the ways I wanted to approach this work was to cooperate and collaborate with the platforms, the well-meaning and good-intentioned platforms as much as possible. So using more carrot than stick, if you will. I also decided the regulatory schemes provide protection, but they remove harmful content after the damage has been done. So a huge part of what we do is around prevention, education, and awareness. It has to be evidence-based, and it has to be evidence-based for a range of reasons. We need to start measuring prevalence and baselines. So we know that for the past 10 years, 1 in 5 children have been cyberbullied. We know that by the time an Australian child is 2, 42% of them have access to a technological device. By the time they're 4, it's 91%. So while we want to use the schools as one vector to provide online safety and respectful relationships education, we also understand that parents are the front line of defense, and we need to arm them with the right tools and strategies so that they can harness the benefits of the technologies, but also minimize the risks by giving them solutions. How we deliver the messages is really important too, the pedagogies we use. If we're using fear, if we're using judgment, that's going to lead to amygdala hijack. So again, you have to be pragmatic and give people some really common strategies and tools that are easy to implement. So prevention, protection. The third part of it is proactive change. So back to what you were saying about trying to stay, technology always outpacing policy. So one of the things we do, we have a technology and emerging issues program. So we're looking at everything from decentralization, doxing, end-to-end encryption. How are these going to manifest themselves? Anonymity and identity shielding. Is it really possible or feasible to have anonymity on the internet, and what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks? Because anonymity could be used for protection if you're a dissident or you're a woman experiencing domestic violence, but it can also be a tool for coercion and hide abuse. So we do that. The other thing that we're doing with the platforms, including Facebook, is a 3-year initiative around safety by design. And the whole idea of that is to shift the responsibility back on the platforms themselves, but change the cultural ethos around moving fast and breaking things or profit at all costs to mindfully assessing risk upfront, building in safety protections in the design and development and deployment process, so that we're not retrofitting protections after the damage has been done. And this is what we've tended to see. Companies will act, and they'll act decisively when there are reputational, regulatory, or revenue risks. But getting them to be proactive, I mean, you can't buy a toy or a consumer good that's defective. You can't buy a car without working airbags or seatbelts, and that's now guided by international standards. We haven't required the same protections to our citizens on technology, and that's why we have a lot of online roadkill.
Thank you, Julie. Simon, I'm going to ask you to jump in here because I think Julie's raised some great points for you to address, and then after that, please do tell us about your examples of best practice.
So I've worked on the issues of online safety for a very long time, much like Julie, albeit in a different setting. Although previously Julie also worked for some of the big tech companies, so she knows what it's like inside the companies. And there are so many examples of good practice. I was actually going to talk about safety by design and the principles and the leadership that Julie's provided on that. I think is a fantastic example of the work that a reasonably well-resourced regulator, which is also looking to encourage best practice, not to punish people for bad practice, is very effective. Another example that we've worked on with Julie and her team is around what should we try and do to address the problem of the sharing of non-consensual intimate images. Julie was one of the first organizations we worked with on a pilot in Australia for helping people to address this problem using some of the technologies that we use around kind of image matching, so that people could upload intimate images that they were worried other people might try to share online, and we could prevent those images being shared on our platforms. So, I mean, it was a bit rocky, wasn't it, Julie, in terms of some reaction to this, headlines about, Facebook wants your nudes now. So we had to get over that kind of tabloid kind of reaction to that. But actually it proved to be a really effective way of partnering with an authoritative organization that people trust to help us do that well. And that's, so I think, that's just one, but there are so many great examples, and I don't know of any of them that don't involve partnership, and whether that's with an organization like Julie's, whether it's with some of the safety organizations like Project Rocket in Australia, who are terrific, and there are so many of those around the world, and then constantly iterating. So it's almost impossible to get things right first time, so keep on improving and then report on the effectiveness of what you're doing. Now, what we shouldn't do is expect that any new online platform can do this, with a flick of a switch. It takes time to build the capability, and you need money to invest. And so it's right that the larger platforms should be held to a higher level of account. But anybody who starts building a big audience, particularly amongst young people, we really do need to get them to be kind of deploying safety by design, as per the great work that Jude has led on that.
Simon, you mentioned the issue of time, which is very pertinent because we've only got about 8 minutes before we have to wrap up. But I also want to talk about time in terms of sequencing, and we've alluded to this in this conversation, which is sometimes technology is that much faster than the regulations coming in and the government partnerships that you're talking about. So how do we get ahead of that? Where do we draw the line and say, okay, we're now all on a level playing field and we can work together, or is it going to be constantly a case of catch up? And then Lee, I know you wanted to come in, so Simon, if you could address that.
Yeah, look, I'll be quick. The key thing is don't regulate on the basis of technology. If you do that, you're absolutely right. It will just you will finally get it wrong. And also don't try and aim for a one-size-fits-all approach. I've seen this happen. So I know we're here to talk about best practice rather than bad examples, but there are examples from other countries where people have tried to say, well, we should all do it this way. And actually that doesn't take account of the different natures of services, the context within which particularly young people use different products for different things. And therefore, this approach, which is more focused on prevalence and on transparency and on constant improvement and holding us to account for that, we believe is the most effective way. Just to be clear, we also don't think there isn't a perfect law out there that we can point to and say everybody should do that. And lots of countries are working on it, including Australia, the UK, where I'm originally from. Many other places are trying to figure this out. And hopefully soon we will see an example where we can say, actually, this country's got it right, and we can all kind of get behind that.
Thank you. Lean, you wanted to address.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I just wanted to reiterate a number of the points that have been made. I think that the point about prevention and partnership is incredibly important. The human rights due diligence process that is embedded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is about identifying, preventing, and mitigate risks to people. And so the companies that effectively embed those processes, they are just better prepared to both when the problem happens, but also to prevent them from happening in the first place. And the partnership angle, I mean, the strong emphasis on engaging with your stakeholders, engaging with those who might be potentially impacted by a technology, and human rights defenders, those who are at risk. It really is just, we want to prevent these issues as much as possible, but also, and finally, it's about civics education, basically, because I think the risks, we're looking at it through specifically the lens of the platforms, the technologies, but it's important also to look at these things. They also exist in in a context. It's not just what is on there that's context specific, but how we can prevent harm from arising is also what is the health of the media situation, the different voices that you can get online and offline. What are the things that kids learn at school? Do they know basic history? Do they know basic civics? So looking at it also, I think when we're tackling the preventive strategies, it has to also include some of these other elements. Otherwise, we're just playing catch up.
Thank you, Lean. I mean, that's a great point actually about civics and also individual responsibility, the role of parents. We haven't touched upon the role of teachers, the role of regular companies, what they're saying to their employees, to their staff about these issues. I'd say, we as journalists always talk about media literacy, trying to inform people, understand at least your sourcing. I'm a history graduate, and I always think about, as historians, we were taught about your primary and secondary sources, and I almost feel like everybody needs to know that now, because when you're looking at something that's been published, and you kind of need to understand where that root is, and it comes to the same point about, if it's an anonymous source, what does that mean? So thank you, Julie. I'm going to turn to you for your final words, particularly looking at this issue of the sequencing and time and how to get out of this catch-up game.
Sure. Well, I mean, we think about this as an arms race, and we need to stay a step ahead of the social engineers, the criminals. We need to find creative ways. Again, we're dealing with human malfeasance here, and they're weaponizing these technology platforms. So we do have to tackle some underlying societal issues. I want to go back to that whole idea of a splinter net, because it is something that we're a little bit concerned about from the regulatory sense. And so we're talking to the UK and to Canada. Fiji set up an online safety commission. Ireland is next. We don't want a splinter net of regulators either. We're trying to bring people along and share what we've learned to build capacity and capability, so people don't make the same mistakes that we made, but so that there isn't duplication and we can work together kind of on some pincher moves. I think there are going to be some tectonic shifts in technology that I know I'm thinking about and being concerned about. End-to-end encryption is one that will certainly be familiar to Simon. The other one is decentralization. So if you're totally working from decentralized networks, and right now you do have organized crime, terrorist groups, and pedophile networks using both end-to-end encryption and decentralization. But as a regulator, how do you take down content when it's distributed and there is no one owner? So there are some real paradigm shifts technologically that we have to think about, and we have to think about the unintended consequences. Back to Lean's point, we're never going to be able to account for everything in legislation, but we as policymakers need to think more actively about what are the unintended consequences.
Thank you, Julie. A perfect note to end on. Just as we wrap up, I just want to highlight some of the points that were made. I mean, one is that certain laws exist, but at the same time, we're not going to regulate our way out of this, to quote Julie. But Simon's stress on trust. A lot of this is going to be about trust. If we're talking about partnerships, we're talking about incentives, it requires trust, and transparency is crucial to trust. But the idea of prevention and protection and how much we can do things in advance. Safety by design, we need to keep designing this, and that's why conversations like this are so important. In addition to encouraging good practice and incentivizing good practice, I'd say one of the things about the splinter net, of course, one issue we didn't talk about is the fact that there are concerns that the actual internet will split between the US and China. I don't think that will happen, but I think that's some of the concerns people think about when they think about the internet and the future of the internet. Measurement systems, putting it in place. There's a lot more to discuss, but at this point, I'm going to hand over to Kathy Lee, who's head of media, entertainment, and sports industries from the World Economic Forum, for closing remarks. Thank you very much to a great panel.
Thank you, Mina, Julie, Simon, and Lynn, for this extremely important discussion on tackling harmful content. At the forum, we've been addressing this topic through our initiative, which is called Advancing Global Digital Safety since 2019. Particularly, we are aware of the real-world harm that the online content is posing to the most vulnerable members of our population, including children. While there are real trade-offs in terms of safety, privacy, and expression, we must not let the narrative be dominated as one versus another. Through our work so far, it is clear that the definition of harm should be a matter of public concern, but it needs the support of private industry to address the problem holistically. We believe that there's a strong need for the forum to provide a space for key stakeholders across the public-private sector to work on new online safety regulation, take coordinated actions to reduce the risk of online harms, and drive forward collaboration on enhancing digital media literacy. So we encourage you to reach out to us at the forum if you would like to learn more about the ways you can engage. Thank you so much again for making the time to be part of this important conversation. And we look forward to working with many of you in the months ahead to drive more deliberate global coordination to improve the safety of our lives online and offline. Thank you again, and thank you to all the panelists and moderator. Have a good day.